Tonight, FBI and ICE storm Minnesota. 400 arrests, $6 billion fraud network. FBI filed.
At 4:47 a.m., federal agents executed the largest coordinated takedown operation in Minnesota history. 400 arrests. 17 simultaneous raids across the Twin Cities and surrounding regions. Over $1.3 billion in fraudulent assets seized. What they uncovered was not simple crime. It was command-level collusion. A hidden empire that had turned an entire state into a fortress for organized narcotics trafficking, human smuggling, and money laundering on a scale that shocked even seasoned federal investigators. This is what happened when the system itself became the weapon. The night was cold and dark when the first teams moved. February in Minneapolis cuts like a blade. Streets empty except for the occasional late-night delivery truck. Fog rolled off the Mississippi River in thick, suffocating clouds. Visibility down to maybe 50 yards. Perfect cover for what was about to unfold. The city had no idea it was about to be invaded from within by its own guardians. At 4:47 a.m. sharp, the first breach came. A nondescript warehouse on the north side of Minneapolis, industrial district, surrounded by empty factories and frozen lots. The building had no windows, just a steel door and a loading dock. The sign outside said, Midwest Logistics and Supply Company. Inside was something else entirely. FBI SWAT teams in black tactical gear moved like shadows. Flashbangs detonated with a violence that shattered the silence. The steel door buckled inward. Agents poured through in a coordinated stream, rifles up, headlamps cutting through smoke and darkness. They found exactly what the surveillance had promised. A fully operational drug sorting and distribution hub. Pallets stacked floor to ceiling with vacuum-sealed packages. Fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine. Nearly 800 kilograms of pure narcotics sitting under industrial lights, waiting to be packaged for street distribution across the Midwest. In the back office, agents found something that made the lead investigator stop. A sealed steel box. Inside it, encrypted hard drives, communication logs, and most importantly, a ledger. Names written in careful handwriting, dollar amounts, dates, authorization codes. One name appeared 43 times. Governor Marcus Thaddeus Whitmore, the elected leader of Minnesota. The man who had just been re-elected by nearly 60% of the vote. Within minutes, 6 other raid teams hit their targets simultaneously across the city. Each location was picked with surgical precision. A high-end massage spa in downtown St. Paul, a front for human trafficking operations that moved vulnerable migrants through Minnesota en route to labor camps and forced commercial work across 3 states. Agents found 37 people being held in basement rooms. Some had been there for months. Financial records showed the operation grossed nearly $12 million monthly in trafficking fees alone. 2 miles away, a raid hit a luxury restaurant in the Edina business district, the kind of place where the city's elite held private dinners. The kitchen was a facade. The real operation was in the sublevels. A complete money laundering operation. 42 suitcases filled with cash sat in climate-controlled storage rooms. $18 million in currency waiting to be processed through shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. Most of it bore chemical markers consistent with drug trafficking operations. The restaurant's owner, a man named David Chun, tried to run. He made it 3 blocks before ICE agents tackled him on a frozen sidewalk. At 5:04 a.m., a third team breached a private residence in the wealthy Wayzata suburb, just outside Minneapolis. The home belonged to James Holloway, the state's commissioner of public safety, the man responsible for overseeing all law enforcement in Minnesota, the man who wrote the training manuals, who set the policy, who controlled the purse strings. They found him in his home office, still in pajamas, staring at a computer screen that he'd been frantically trying to delete when agents came through the doors. By 6:15 a.m., the 4th simultaneous operation was underway in a rural area near the Canadian border, about 90 minutes north of Minneapolis. A converted grain facility that no longer listed any owner. Satellite imagery had shown truck traffic at unusual hours. Late night arrivals. Quick turnarounds. No commercial justification. When ICE agents and Border Patrol personnel breached the structure, they found human trafficking infrastructure on an industrial scale. Holding cells, processing stations, crude medical facilities, pharmaceutical records showing the distribution of controlled substances to keep migrants compliant and scared. 84 people were rescued, many of them from Central and South America, all of them bearing signs of physical abuse and malnutrition. But the most significant discovery was the tunnel system. Running beneath the facility, carved through Minnesota bedrock, was a tunnel network that extended nearly 4 miles. Sophisticated engineering, reinforced concrete, electrical infrastructure, ventilation systems. It connected to a private airstrip 5 miles away, where a Cessna with Mexican registration numbers sat in a hangar, recently refueled. The tunnel was designed for one purpose: to move product, large quantities, without detection, without inspection, without leaving any record in the normal supply chain. By 7:30 a.m., the operational hub had shifted. A command center set up at the FBI's field office in downtown Minneapolis. Digital forensics teams were already working on the encrypted servers pulled from the warehouse and the governor's home. Cybersecurity specialists cracked the first layers of encryption within 40 minutes. What they found made the room go silent. A comprehensive digital map. Project Northbound. That was the operations name. It showed 17 years of planning, 23 shell corporations, 41 fake non-profit foundations, a web of logistics companies, agricultural export firms, and financial entities that stretched across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and into Canada. The architecture was brilliant, almost elegant in its complexity, but it all traced back to one source. One command center. One corrupted official who had been redesigning the entire state apparatus to serve a single purpose. Governor Marcus Thaddeus Whitmore had not simply allowed organized crime to happen in Minnesota. He had engineered it. He had redesigned the entire law enforcement and governance structure to facilitate it. From the top down, systematic corruption had been installed like infrastructure, like plumbing, like it was meant to last forever. The financial investigators could trace the money flows. Over $80 million had been paid to various government officials, law enforcement officers, and judicial figures over the past 17 years. Border Patrol agents at crossing stations had been systematically paid to look the other way. Way stations had been scheduled for maintenance exactly when cartel convoys were scheduled to pass through. Patrol routes had been altered to create blind spots. Raid schedules had been leaked to assets in the field. Internal investigations into suspicious officers had been buried. Criminal charges against known traffickers had been mysteriously dismissed in court. It was not corruption. That word was too small. This was command-level collusion. This was a shadow government operating inside the legitimate one. This was the installation of a parallel law enforcement system that answered to the cartel instead of the people. By 8 a.m., the operational tempo had accelerated beyond anything anyone had anticipated. Federal command had made the decision to move fast. Within hours, before word could spread, before allies could coordinate escape, before evidence could be destroyed. A unified federal task force comprised of FBI, DEA, ICE, and DHS agents, coordinated with the Minnesota State Police officers who had been cleared by federal vetting, began executing a statewide operation under the code name Operation Clean Slate. The digital map showed 53 cartel-connected locations across Minnesota, 41 more across the upper Midwest in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois. Federal command authorized a staggered assault designed to hit all Minnesota targets within a 2-hour window. Black Hawk helicopters were brought in, armored vehicles, K-9 units. Over 800 federal agents mobilized across 4 states. The National Guard was placed on standby. Every major interstate checkpoint was secured. A cartel superlab in an industrial complex near St. Cloud. 3 stories, disguised as a pharmaceutical packaging facility. When agents breached it, they found machinery capable of pressing 3 million fentanyl pills per day. The fentanyl supply chain alone was worth an estimated $240 million annually. Agents seized over 40 million fentanyl pills, nearly 3 tons of bulk fentanyl powder, and complete operational blueprints showing this facility was one of 7 identical labs across the Midwest. A fortress mansion in the Edina Hills, belonging to a business executive named Thomas Kirkland, who was later revealed to be a cartel lieutenant. The home contained a private armory with military-grade weapons, assault rifles, grenades, explosive charges, and commercial surveillance equipment. Agents found a command center in the basement with real-time monitoring of law enforcement frequencies and federal databases. This mansion was the coordination point for cartel operations across Minnesota. Multiple officers had been observed entering it on off-duty hours. Money had been exchanged. Information had been passed. Command decisions had been made. Another raid hit a hidden tunnel entrance in the Minneapolis sewage system that connected directly to an underground casino and money count facility. $17 million in fresh currency was being processed when agents arrived. 32 individuals were arrested on the premises, 14 of them wearing badges or federal credentials. A migrant smuggling convoy was intercepted on I-94 near the Wisconsin border after ICE had tracked its movement for 6 hours. Inside the trailer, they found 63 people crammed into a space designed for cargo. Medical conditions were critical. 2 individuals required immediate hospitalization. The convoy was headed for Chicago, and from there, would have been distributed to labor camps across the country. Each person represented a profit margin of between $3,000 and $8,000 to the smuggling operation. The annual revenue from human trafficking alone was estimated at $34 million. By 11:45 a.m., the operation had achieved something unprecedented in scale and coordination. In less than 7 hours, federal agencies had executed 68 simultaneous raids. 400 individuals had been arrested. Over $500 million in cash, assets, and property had been seized. Nearly 2,000 kilograms of cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, and methamphetamine had been removed from circulation. More than 110 people who were victims of trafficking or forced labor had been rescued. The underworld had taken more damage in 6 hours than in the previous 6 years. Over the next 72 hours, federal investigators working in the cyber forensics lab beneath the FBI's Minneapolis field office began the systematic analysis of the servers and data they had recovered. Encrypted files were cracked, cloud storage was accessed, communication logs were reconstructed, and the true scope of the infiltration became terrifyingly clear. The corruption ran so deep that it was not isolated to Minneapolis or even Minnesota. Federal investigators discovered that this cartel network, operating under the direction of Governor Whitmore and funded by what they later identified as a major trafficking organization based in Guadalajara, had successfully infiltrated law enforcement agencies across 5 states. 47 local police officers had been on cartel payroll, 33 border patrol agents, 12 federal court judges, 8 state legislators, 2 United States postal inspectors, and multiple employees within the DEA and FBI field offices themselves, individuals who had access to investigative files and surveillance data. The breadth of the infiltration meant that entire investigative operations had been compromised. Raids that should have succeeded had failed because targets had been warned. Indictments that should have been filed had been blocked. Witnesses had been intimidated or disappeared. The cartel did not just operate in Minnesota. They owned Minnesota. They had turned the state apparatus into their security infrastructure. When federal investigators examined the internal communications between compromised law enforcement officers and their cartel handlers, they found a language that went beyond simple payoffs. These were command relationships. Officers were being assigned missions. Specific cartel members were being protected from investigation. Rival organizations were being targeted for disruption. Border corridors were being held open for trafficking operations. Convoy routes were being cleared. Federal databases were being monitored and searched on behalf of cartel interests. It was not a police force that had been corrupted. It was a police force that had been subordinated. One email exchange captured the reality better than any investigation summary could. It was between a high-ranking state police superintendent and a cartel operations chief. Confirm receipt of Week 5 projections. 3 shipments scheduled for Wednesday. Route 35 will be clear per agreement. We have moved the checkpoint as discussed. Confirm security clearance for personnel roster attached. Payment will be processed Friday as scheduled. This was not corruption. This was administration. This was bureaucratic process. This was the normal operation of a shadow government. The most shocking discovery came when investigators examined border crossing manifests and highway way station records. They found a pattern so systematic that it could only be described as policy. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, the checkpoint at the Minnesota-Canadian border was scheduled for maintenance or equipment testing, shutting it down for exactly 90 minutes. During that 90-minute window, 3 to 5 trucks bearing legitimate commercial registrations passed through without inspection. The trucks were always the same make and model. The drivers always had the correct documentation. Nothing appeared amiss. But the cargo was always the same. Bulk narcotics, cash, sometimes human trafficking victims. The pattern had repeated every week for 6 years. Never varied, never failed. It was scheduled like a bus route. This was not a failure of the system. This was the system working exactly as it had been redesigned to work. Federal investigators identified the individual who had designed this system at every level. Governor Marcus Thaddeus Whitmore had not simply taken bribes and looked the other way. He had personally overseen the recruitment of key law enforcement personnel. He had written the policies that created the openings through which the cartel could operate. He had secured judicial cooperation to ensure that any cases that somehow surfaced would be dismissed. He had used his authority over state police budgets and infrastructure to position assets exactly where the cartel needed them. He had, with deliberation and precision, turned Minnesota into a secure operating base for organized narcotics trafficking. The investigation revealed that Whitmore's total take from the arrangement was approximately $470 million, hidden in offshore accounts and disguised through shell corporations. His corruption had purchased 3 properties in Dubai, a yacht registered in the Cayman Islands, and investments in companies across Mexico and Central America. He had not simply betrayed his oath. He had constructed an alternative power structure and positioned himself as its administrator. Federal agents arrested him at his residence on the evening, exactly 24 hours after the initial raids. He was reading in his study when they came through the doors. He did not resist. He did not appear surprised. When the lead investigator asked him why he had done it, why he had sold his state to the cartel, Whitmore simply smiled and said, because they offered me more than Minnesota ever could. The arrest of the governor was only the beginning of a cascade of federal prosecutions. Over the next 2 weeks, 43 additional law enforcement officers were arrested. 7 judges were indicted. 16 politicians resigned or faced federal charges. A statewide corruption task force was established to audit every law enforcement agency from top to bottom. Internal affairs investigations that had been shelved were reopened. Cases that had been dismissed were refiled. Witnesses who had been intimidated were offered new protection and incentives to come forward. The depth of the infiltration meant that the entire criminal justice system in Minnesota had to be rebuilt, not reformed, rebuilt, because the foundation had been poisoned. Federal investigators also began to understand the larger strategic architecture. This was not an accident that a major cartel had been able to completely infiltrate one state. This appeared to be part of a larger strategy. Intelligence analysts discovered that similar infiltration operations had been attempted or achieved in 3 other states. Arizona, Texas, and California all showed signs of systematic law enforcement corruption connected to organized trafficking. If the pattern was deliberate, if this was part of a coordinated cartel strategy to install parallel governments in key states, then what had been uncovered in Minnesota was not an isolated case. It was a template. It was a blueprint. It was a model for how to turn an entire state into a cartel asset. The financial component of the investigation revealed the economic scale of the operation. The cartel had been able to move an average of 430 kilograms of cocaine, 280 kilograms of heroin, and nearly 900 kilograms of methamphetamine through Minnesota every week. The wholesale value was estimated at $15 million weekly. The retail value of the drugs on American streets was estimated at $80 million weekly. Over $4 billion annually in revenue. All of it flowing through a system that had been redesigned to facilitate it. All of it protected by a shadow government that wore official badges. The human trafficking component added another dimension of horror. Investigators estimated that the network had processed nearly 4,000 vulnerable individuals through trafficking operations over the past 6 years. Women, children, men forced into labor. All of them moved through Minnesota as if it were a commercial hub. All of them exploited for profit. All of it hidden behind the authority of official law enforcement. When the news broke, Minnesota erupted. The arrest of a sitting governor on corruption and conspiracy charges sent shockwaves through the state. Resignation calls came from across the political spectrum. Calls for federal receivership of the state police. Demands for the removal of any officer who had served under Whitmore's administration. Families of people who had been victimized by cartel violence over the past 17 years came forward with accusations that their cases had been ignored or mishandled because the system was compromised. The media coverage was relentless. Cable news networks ran continuous coverage. Newspaper investigation teams dug into the connections. Documentary crews began filming interviews with survivors of trafficking. The story became national, became a symbol of something deeper than corruption, became a warning about what happens when power serves itself instead of the people. Federal investigators also began to understand why this infiltration had been so successful. It was not because cartel operatives were clever criminals. They were. But it was more than that. It was because they had understood something fundamental about American systems. Authority is trusted. Badges are trusted. Official documents are trusted. If you control who wears the badge and who signs the document, you control the system. And that is exactly what the cartel had done. By controlling the men and women in authority positions, the cartel had effectively written the rules. They had turned the very institutions designed to stop them into instruments of their own expansion. They had converted public trust into private advantage. They had, for nearly 2 decades, operated a parallel government that answered not to voters or constitutional authority but to the cartel's command structure. The investigation expanded beyond Minnesota into federal systems. The National Guard was not called in not because of any threat of organized resistance, but because the scope of the audit was so vast. Over 1,000 federal auditors, investigators, and security personnel fanned out across Minnesota law enforcement agencies. Background checks were rerun. Internal communications were reviewed. Financial records were audited. Suspicions that had been buried were resurrected. Corruption cases that had gone cold were reopened. Exactly 17 days after the initial raid, federal investigators had charged a total of 417 individuals in connection with the cartel infiltration network. The charges ranged from drug trafficking and money laundering to human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and corruption of law enforcement. The conspiracy charges alone carried sentences of life imprisonment. Governor Marcus Thaddeus Whitmore was charged with 73 separate federal counts, including racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, human trafficking, and breaches of the public trust. Federal prosecutors estimated the total value of his crimes at over $1.2 billion. The government moved to seize all of his assets, both domestic and international. The Minnesota State Police was placed under federal supervision. The department's leadership was entirely replaced. Every officer who had served during Whitmore's administration and who had any documented contact with known cartel members was suspended pending investigation. The hiring freeze on new officers lasted for 3 months while background check protocols were completely redesigned. The entire organizational culture was treated as potentially contaminated. More significantly, the investigation revealed a chilling truth about how close the cartel had come to complete success. Documents found in Whitmore's personal files showed that the plan had always been larger. Minnesota was meant to be the first domino, a proof of concept. Once fully operational, the intention was to expand the network to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois, to create a regional cartel state spanning the entire upper Midwest, to have governors, judges, legislators, and law enforcement in multiple states all answering to the same cartel structure. The timeline suggested that within 2 to 3 years, if the operation had continued undetected, the cartel would have had enough political influence to begin shaping state policy in ways that openly favored cartel interests. Drug sentencing laws could have been reduced, border security could have been further degraded, money laundering regulations could have been weakened. The entire criminal justice system of multiple states could have been subtly but systematically restructured to serve cartel interests while maintaining the appearance of normal governance. It was a quiet revolution. It did not require violence or open conflict. It only required patience, money, and the willingness of enough people to choose personal profit over public duty. The final revelation came from the intelligence agencies. After the Minnesota infiltration was exposed, the DEA and FBI conducted a comprehensive review of cartel operations across the United States. What they discovered was disturbing. The cartel cell that had infiltrated Minnesota was not unique. Similar operations had been attempted in 5 other states. Arizona had a partial network that had been detected and disrupted. California had evidence of ongoing infiltration at the municipal level. Texas had multiple cartel-connected officials in border counties. Florida and New York showed signs of significant organized crime influence over law enforcement at the county and city level. The Minnesota case was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. It was a strategy that was being deployed across the country. Infiltrate, corrupt, install, consolidate, expand. It was cartel strategy adapted for the American system. Instead of controlling through violence, control through position. Instead of taking power, inherit it by becoming the administrators of existing power structures. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it only requires silence. Sometimes it only requires ambition. Sometimes it requires nothing more than a governor willing to trade his oath for a larger bank account. The human cost was the part that stayed with investigators long after the files were closed. 4,000 people trafficked through Minnesota over 6 years. Hundreds of families destroyed by opioid addiction fueled by $4 billion in cartel narcotics flowing through the system every year. Neighborhoods across the state corrupted by violence and addiction. Innocent people killed by dealers who operated with impunity because the people who should have stopped them had been paid not to. One victim's impact statement, delivered at a federal hearing, captured it perfectly. Maria Chun, a woman trafficked from Guatemala and held in forced labor for 18 months before rescue, spoke directly to the judge. "I was held in the same country that said it would protect me. The police that I was taught to trust were working for the people who owned me. I did not just lose my freedom. I lost my trust in everything." That is what this corruption does. It does not just break laws. It breaks the entire idea that there is anyone left to help. The immediate investigation was largely complete. The federal task force had achieved what it set out to do. 400 arrests. Over $1.3 billion in assets seized. The leadership structure of the cartel network dismantled. The infiltration of Minnesota law enforcement exposed and the system placed under federal reconstruction. But the larger question remained. How many other states? How many other infiltrations had succeeded? How many other shadow governments were operating inside the legitimate ones? How deep did this go? The message from federal leadership was clear. It was not finished. This was not the end. This was the beginning of a comprehensive national security review of every state law enforcement agency, of every municipal police department in major cities, of federal agencies that had shown any sign of compromise. The entire system was going to be audited. The story of Minnesota became a national symbol of something Americans had to face. The system could be corrupted. The institutions designed to protect people could be converted to harm them. The people who took an oath to serve and protect could choose to serve and protect themselves instead. And when they did, they could hide behind the authority of the very offices they had betrayed. The only thing that stood between freedom and subjugation was the integrity of the people trusted with power. And when money and violence entered the equation, that integrity became fragile. Governor Marcus Thaddeus Whitmore sat in a federal detention facility awaiting trial. He had been offered no bail. He had been deemed too much of a flight risk. His attorneys were already preparing appeals on constitutional grounds. They would argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the financial records could be interpreted differently, that the communications were ambiguous, that Whitmore was a victim of a deep state operation designed to remove him from power. Some people would believe it. Some people always do. But the evidence was public. The documents were available. 400 arrests. 1.3 billion in seized assets. 110 trafficking victims rescued. The pattern was undeniable. This is what federal law enforcement uncovered in Minnesota. Not simple corruption, not isolated crime, but the systematic infiltration and corruption of an entire state government by organized crime. A shadow government operating inside the legitimate one. A cartel that had nearly succeeded in establishing permanent control over a major American state through the installation of complicit officials at every level of authority. It is a story that warns us about the fragility of democracy, about how power does not always announce itself, about how the greatest threats sometimes come from within, about how the institutions designed to protect us can become weapons against us if we are not vigilant. And it is a story that is not finished, because if it happened in Minnesota, it can happen anywhere. The infiltration was detected. The corruption was exposed. The system is being rebuilt. But the larger question remains unanswered. How many other states have yet to face their own reckoning? If you are watching this, if this story has reached you, then share it. Comment. Demand transparency from your government. Demand accountability from your law enforcement. Demand that every official prove their loyalty is to the Constitution and the people, not to themselves or to criminal enterprises. This is a work of fictional dramatization created for storytelling purposes. The characters are invented, the agencies are real, but the operations and events are fictional. But the danger it illustrates is not fictional. Infiltration is real. Corruption is real. The vulnerability of our systems is real.